Hey everybody, welcome to DCARI's 16th virtual fire investigative training session. As you know, hopefully you've taken some of the other classes that we have, but we're sponsored by the Dane County Fire Chiefs Association, which is a 28-member department located in Dane County, Wisconsin. Today we have Randy Watson, who is the Director of Technical Training at SEA. Randy is also the former chairman of the 921 Committee. He is also the chairman of the current 1321 standard, which is the fire investigative unit standard that's in the process of coming out in the near future. So today, Randy is going to go over the changes to 921 and the 2021 edition, updates and changes. Randy, go ahead and take it away.
All right, thank you. I appreciate it. It's great to be with everyone and really thank what Dane County is doing, pushing out training, especially during this past year when so many training opportunities in person have had to be canceled due to the pandemic. And having opportunities like this means a lot to the fire investigation community, as well as being able to maintain certifications. So I really appreciate everything they're doing. Today, we're going to talk about Nfpa and fire investigation. Arguably, no one has had a bigger impact on the fire investigation community than the things that have come out of IAAI, but especially Nfpa and the documents they produce. So today we're going to look at 3 documents with a focus on 921, but we're also going to look at a couple of other documents that are in the works and changes being made. But before we get into the documents, I have a challenge for you. The challenge is that your growth as a professional, as a fire investigator, even as a person, is based on your willingness to invest. But not just invest, your willingness to invest in yourself and others. I have grown tremendously over my 40 plus years in fire investigation. But the times I grew the most were when someone took the time and effort to invest in me and show me and explain to me and help me grow. However, the times I have really grown is when I have invested in others, taken the time with someone just starting out in fire investigation, someone that is growing, to not only show them what I do, but most importantly, explain to them why I am doing it. Because people don't buy into what you do, they buy into why you do it. So I challenge everybody listening from around the world to invest in yourself, just like you're doing by attending this training today, but take the time to invest in someone else. Share with them what you're doing and why you're doing it. It will make you a better investigator. Well, suppose this is your case. This is a criminal case that was in the state of Georgia. And in this particular case, the state was using a private investigator as their expert in the criminal case. In this particular case, the judge brought up an issue. There was a challenge to the private investigator. And the judge indicated that the foundation for evidence is based on scientific principle or technique that requires 2 findings for reliability. And that reliability is a buzzword that you will hear today multiple times. The judge is tasked with the gatekeeper, and as part of their gatekeeper duties, it is to evaluate the reliability of expert testimony. Well, the judge says such evidence is admissible upon showing by the party offering the evidence 2 things. The first is that the general scientific principles and techniques involved are valid and capable of producing, there you see the word again, reliable results. I'll give you a shortened version. That the investigator is using the right methodology. The second is linked to the first, that the person performing the test or working through the methodology substantially performed the scientific procedures or the methodology in an acceptable manner. So you have to use the right methodology. You have to use it the right way. So those are the two keys that the judge is applying in this case. Now, in this case, the expert used 921 to conduct his investigation and determine that the fire cause was intentional. And he indicates that he uses 921 to do that. The judge says 921 is the universally recognized standard methodology. Many people look at 921 and say, well, it says right on the front cover, it is a guide. This judge is considering it the standard for methodology in arriving at origin and cause conclusions. And he cites some cases. Then he goes on to say 921 has achieved general acceptance in the fire investigation community. That really can't be argued, or we wouldn't be here today talking about it. The general acceptance of 921 really began in the fire investigation community around 1998, 2000. Prior to that, there wasn't much general acceptance in the fire investigation community. Since that time, you can't go to any seminar where they discuss fire that 921 is one of the key topics. The judge goes on to say the guidelines laid out in 921 had been used to determine whether fire investigators should be qualified as expert witnesses in courts. Notice the judge is not referring to 1033 here. He's referring to 921 because of the methodology. Therefore, the judge says 921 has reached the scientific stage of verifiable certainty and passes the first portion of the test, that it is the right methodology. This expert generated a relatively short report. After reading the expert's report, it is apparent he failed to show that he applied the guidelines of 921 reliably, there's the word again, to the facts of the case. As you can see, he prepared a short 2.5-page report with only bare minimum conclusions. Now, in this expert's defense, he was retained by an insurance carrier who sent him out to conduct an investigation, and the insurance carrier instructed him to do a short report so they can put it in their file. The report was never prepared in anticipation of being used in a litigation situation. This expert has been around a very long time. As a matter of fact, this expert served on the 921 committee for many years. But in 2.5 pages, you really can't, as that first sentence discusses, show how you apply 921. The report states that based on fire damage and fire pattern analysis, the fire originated at a particular location. However, the report does not detail how 921 was used. Remember, there are two criteria this judge used. Are you using the right methodology? The expert says he used 921, so he's using the right methodology. However, his report does not effectively articulate how he used 921 or the principles of 921 to reach his conclusions. This is a Daubert challenge of this expert. And in a Daubert challenge, the issue is not what your ultimate conclusion is, as is indicated here, does not show how he used 921 to get there. So it's about the methodology. In a 2.5-page report, you really can't show much about your process and your methodology. The closest thing in the report is a statement that is a version of which is in every private fire investigator report I've ever read. You see this also in a lot of public sector reports now. And you see the statement here in quotation marks that in accordance with the guidance set forth in NFPA 921, this fire can be classified as intentionally set. So he states in his report in accordance with 921, indicating that he used 921. But look at the next statement. However, this does not show that the expert applied the methodology reliably. Getting to the second point that the judge brought up in that early slide. The mere assertion that an expert applied 921 is insufficient to establish that is based on the methods or procedures of science rather than just on the subjective belief and unsupported speculation. What the judge is saying, you can't pay lip service to the fact of using 921. You have to be able to articulate and demonstrate that you applied the methodology properly. In this particular case, there was a Daubert hearing. That is not always the case. Many times a Daubert challenge is resolved simply based on petitions submitted by the parties. The defense in this case would have submitted a petition to challenge and get the expert excluded. The defense or the prosecutor would have filed petitions stating why the expert should not be excluded. Many times the judge will make their decision on an evaluation of the petitions. In this case, the judge held a hearing and called the expert to testify. And the expert testified about his methods in greater detail in the hearing, but the judge found that that was not enough to find that he met the second portion of the test to be qualified as an expert witness, that being how he applied the methodology. So even though he testified in more detail, the report was so insufficient. Reports are important. You'll see that time and time again. I would encourage everyone to take time in preparing your report. I know DCARI has done a couple of sessions on report writing. That is incredibly important. The better your report is prepared, the better you can defend a challenge like this. Then the judge uses an interesting analogy. The judge says the facts of this case are like to a grade school math problem. I always hated that when the teachers told me this in school. They would say you only get partial credit for getting the right answer. You got to show your work. Well, this judge basically said the same thing. In order to receive credit, the student must not only get the right answer, but must also show their work as to how they achieved that answer. The judge indicates the expert achieved an answer in the case, but failed to show how he used 921 to get to that answer. Therefore, this court can't find that the expert substantially performed the scientific procedures in an acceptable manner and was excluded. So not only must you indicate the methodology, you have to demonstrate and articulate that you applied the methodology in an acceptable way. Well, let's look at the second case. Another criminal case, the state of Florida. Again, this is the district attorney has decided to use a private sector expert in their case. Interesting part of this case is the defense employed an expert. And in this case, the defense expert testified that the state's fire investigator failed to meet minimum standards of care, and he identifies 5 areas. First, he failed to collect and preserve sufficient data. Secondly, he failed to apply peer-reviewed standards to his investigation. Third, failed to recognize that the scene had been compromised. Fourth, failed to test or validate any of his hypotheses as to what was there. And then finally, failed to employ common peer-reviewed standards and authoritative text to substantiate his findings. So these are all things that the defense expert pointed out that were wrong with the state's witness. The defense expert further testified that the state's expert was not sufficiently familiar with 921 or other peer-reviewed publications or treatises. The defense expert opined that there was a lack of requisite training under 1033 to qualify as an expert. So the expert for the defense has talked about his methodology, his knowledge, and his training. Now, in this lower section, you see where the state's expert concedes some things. Now, this is the state's expert conceding that he is not a current member of any professional fire protection. This is directly out of the ruling. I'm assuming he's talking about any professional fire association, that he possesses only rudimentary understanding of fire chemistry. This is the witness himself conceding this. He only has rudimentary understanding of fire chemistry, testified he has no training in combustion science or materials combustion analysis, and that he relies upon his experience as a firefighter and fire investigator regarding his opinion as to what may or may not have been present in the debris when he went through it. Now, back in the day, that last sentence may have been enough. Relying on your experience as a firefighter and to render opinions. Now, that's not sufficient. When you are conceding that you have only a minimal understanding of fire chemistry, you have no training in fire combustion or combustion science, that's going to make it very difficult to offer opinions regarding fire origin and spread. Look at what the court says. I've never seen a court dress down a witness like they did this one. The court determines the state's witness lacks requisite scientific knowledge, so he doesn't have the knowledge or the science-based knowledge to offer reliable, there's the word again, or relevant opinion, that his testimony is not supported by sufficient facts or data. That's getting into the scientific method, or the product of reliable principles or methodology. The court further determines the witness does not possess any technical or specialized knowledge to permit any non-scientific expert opinion. So he doesn't have any scientific knowledge. He can't render a non-scientific expert opinion. And finally, the court does not find that the expert possesses the requisite training or qualifications to render such an opinion. So he doesn't have the knowledge, he doesn't have the facts, he doesn't apply the methodology appropriately, and he doesn't have the necessary training. And as a result, the court determines that his opinions lack probative value and would tend to mislead the jury. And he was excluded. These two cases are a wake-up call. A lot of times we hear of Daubert challenges in the civil world. But these two experts, even though they were private, were testifying in a criminal case, and judges excluded them. What we do is important. What we're going to talk about today is also important. Before we get into the actual documents, I need to put a disclaimer out here that the views expressed during the presentation are solely mine. I don't represent that the views are of Nfpa, of 1033, 921, or the 1321 committees, of which I'm on all three of them. These are my views and my views alone. Well, you heard in those court cases, the judges talk about methodology. Methodology has been in 921 since the first edition in 1992. So it's nothing new, and it's not brain surgery or rocket science. I'm sure if we brought everybody up on the Zoom and we brought you in one at a time, each one of you could walk through the 7 steps, talking about the steps of the scientific method. But there's a difference in understanding them and applying them. Understanding is you know what they are. Applying them is applying them here. Can you apply the steps of the scientific method on the fire scene? This is one of the fires I've been involved in. And can you apply it when you've got a building this size that's flat on the ground? If you can't, you're going to be in trouble. So you have to start thinking about the scientific method before you ever get the call or head to the scene. You have to be able to apply it on the fire scene. You have to apply it to your reports. There's been some classes on report writing, and you saw in that first case we talked about, the judge was very critical that the expert did not demonstrate how they applied the methodology correctly. So you have to be able to apply it in the report. And ultimately, you have to be able to apply the methodology here. Here you've got a judge that's going to evaluate your methodology. In most instances, a judge knows very little about fire and less about fire investigation. However, they are tasked with the gatekeeper to determine whether they're going to allow your testimony to be presented to those people sitting in the jury box that weren't able to get out of jury duty that week. So you've got to be able to articulate and demonstrate to both the judge, so you're allowed to testify, and that jury, so they understand. There's where the difference between understanding and application comes into play. So let's run through these steps right quick. Recognize the need. This one's easy. This is the what. This is identifying what the problem is. In our case, we've had a fire and we need to figure out the origin and the cause. So we start with the what. That happens before any of us ever know that a fire existed. Somebody has identified the what. Well, the second part of scientific method is the how. Once we've identified what the problem is, how are we going to address it? How are we going to solve that problem? And in our world, we're going to solve that problem by conducting a proper origin and cause investigation. And it's going to involve a lot of different things: inspections, examinations, interviews, material review, data collection, research, analysis. There's going to be a lot that goes into it, but it all boils down to conducting a proper origin and cause. So we've identified the what and the how. Now it's where the rubber meets the road, is the data collection. Various facts about the incident are gathered, and these are gathered through observations, interviews, investigation, research, and the data is going to include both seen and non-seen data. Non-seen data is an area that was expanded in 921 for the 2021 edition. So it's important to not just limit to the seen, but what non-seen data might be available that you need to collect. And the data that we collect through observations, experience, is called empirical data. It's capable of being verified in some manner. So we got to collect data. We have nothing until we collect data. We have no opinions. We have no hypotheses. This is a data-driven analysis. The scientific method is. Well, collecting data is not enough. You got to do something with it. And that's where the analysis comes into play. Analysis is understanding what the data means collectively. It's based on our knowledge, our training, experience, expertise that we have. Now, this is why we can have two investigators look at the same set of data and come up with different opinions. One expert may not have a lot of experience. They're relatively new or young into the profession. Whereas another expert may have a tremendous amount of training, experience, and knowledge. Well, it's easy to see when you've got those two variables how the actual hypotheses may be different. But the analysis is us trying to explain the data so that we develop an initial working hypothesis. Based on the analysis of the data, we develop generally multiple hypotheses. The hypotheses should explain the what that we discussed when we define the problem. What is the issue? We're going to have various, but the key is remember to consider alternate hypotheses. Your analysis of the data may indicate an origin at a specific location. However, as you're standing there and you're looking around the compartment, the room, the home, whatever you're involved with, consider alternate hypotheses. Could the fire have started somewhere else in the room and created the same burn patterns that you have? So many times I've seen investigators, when they're asked, well, did you consider any alternate hypotheses? And they will say, well, no. When actuality, most of the time they do. Could the fire have started in another location? You evaluate the patterns. Are the patterns consistent with what they have? You're applying the principles of science. Had the fire originated at that location, it would have spread and grown in a certain way based on your knowledge of fire dynamics. Is that what you have? If the answer is no, then you eliminate this alternate hypothesis, but at least you considered it. So you're going to develop initial working hypotheses, but that's not where you stop. Even if you're on the public sector, that's not where you stop. You have to test. test your hypothesis. And this testing of hypotheses has seemed to be where many struggle with how do they address this. And the first struggle is understanding what testing is. We tend to think of testing as going out and conducting a burn test, building something, acquiring some material, going forward, and conducting some type of test. That can be part of your test. Many times we've been on fire scenes and someone will go, wonder if this will burn. You go out, find someone that has a lighter or a match, and you test. Yes, this will burn with the application of an open flame. You have tested and a hypothesis concerning will this material ignite. However, that's not the only way to test your hypothesis. Testing is a process where you compare the hypothesis to all the known facts as well as the body of science or scientific knowledge associated with the specific incident. Sometimes that comparison is physically, sometimes it is analytically. And you need to test that hypothesis or your hypotheses until all feasible hypotheses have been tested and one is determined to be uniquely consistent with the facts and principles of science. The key aspect here is uniquely consistent. Excuse me. You're looking for your hypothesis to be the only hypothesis consistent with all the known facts. And as we said, testing can be physically or analytically. I test my origin hypothesis analytically on every fire scene. When I have completed my fire scene examination, I like to get cleaned up, put my equipment away, get my iPad and my camera and walk back through the scene. I am reviewing the scene, I'm reviewing the data, I'm reviewing it with the hypotheses in mind. I'm looking for how do I tell the story of this scene. And as I do that, I am evaluating my origin. If I believe the fire originated on the kitchen counter, I will review the entire scene. Could this fire start anywhere else based on my knowledge of the principles of science and created the patterns we have here? If the answer is, well, yeah, there's some other places or there's another place and it would have created the same patterns, then I don't have a uniquely consistent hypothesis yet. And I'm testing this hypothesis in an attempt to disprove it. I want to disprove the hypothesis. If I am trying to prove it, then I can get into bias. And you start manipulating enough data to be able to prove something. Versus, here is my hypothesis, the fire originated on the kitchen counter. I'm reviewing all the burn patterns, trying to disprove that hypothesis and find ways that the patterns, the fire effects are not consistent with that hypothesis. If the inability to refute the hypothesis does not mean that hypothesis is true. If I can't refute it, that doesn't mean it is true. It means it is possible. the obvious question, are there any other hypotheses that are also possible? If the answer is no, and it is uniquely consistent, all right, then you're getting to your final answer. If your hypothesis is disproved, you've got more work to do. You've got to go back, collect additional data. Maybe you've got all the data available, do additional analysis, which leads to, a new hypothesis, and testing. If it leads you to the same hypothesis that you tested and disproved, then maybe you need to get some help. Maybe sit down with another investigator and walk through the data with them and analysis to see, are you missing something? Maybe you're not missing anything, but you can't get to that unique hypothesis that is only consistent with the data. But once the hypothesis has been tested, the investigator should review the entire process to make sure you've accounted for all of the data and all of the possible alternate hypotheses. Are there any other hypotheses that are consistent with the data? Now, I've mentioned that multiple times, but that is important. If the answer is no, then you have a unique final hypothesis. If the answer is yes, there are other hypotheses that are consistent with the data, then you are left with the specific hypothesis is going to be undetermined, which we'll talk about. But understanding and applying the scientific method is the foundation of everything we're going to talk about today. And as you saw in those court cases, it applied there as well. If the judges are using it and applying it, we need to also. So let's look at the legs of the fire investigation stool. We have the fire investigator, which 1033 addresses. We have the fire investigation that 921 addresses. And now we have fire investigation units, 1321. And that's what we're going to spend the rest of our time together on, these three documents. Everyone is familiar with 921 and 1033, but 1321 is new. It is under development. Nfpa Standards Council received a new project initiative request to prepare a standard on fire investigation units. And this was received from the National Institute of Standards and Technology, NIST, that was in partnership with the Department of Justice that organized the Organization of Scientific Area Committees, OSAC as it's referred to. This was a result of the forensic science study that was done and published about 2009, and it was not very complimentary of the state of forensic science in the United States. As a result of that study, NIST and Department of Justice received funding to establish this committee. And this committee had many subcommittees. There was one on chemistry and DNA and hairs and fibers and tool marks, and fire and explosion investigation was one of those subcommittees. This started in the fall of 2017, and I was appointed to this committee. They were taking applications. The initial chairman of the committee was Dr. Craig Byler, and anyone could apply. With this particular committee, each one serves a 3-year term, and you can serve one other 3-year term. Then you must rotate off for at least a year. Then you can come back. I served the initial committee. We drew straws basically so that we could establish the rotation. So I served my time, served another 3-year term, was off a year, as an affiliate, and now I am back on the committee as a principal member. But this OSAC was charged with improving forensic science by either developing standards or improving the standards that exist. The request they made to Nfpa was to prepare a new standard on fire investigation units. OSAC felt that that was the one area that was not addressed by any current standards or guides. OSAC defined a fire investigation unit as any public or private sector organization performing fire and explosion investigations. So it applies to both. Normally, when we think of a fire investigation unit, we tend to think of public sector. However, the scope of this, or the plan for this, was to incorporate all, both public and private. So an insurance company, SIU unit that specializes in fire investigation would be considered a fire investigation unit. So that was the initial request made by the OSAC committee. The Standards Council decided to publish the request. That is normally what happens when a request for a new standard is made, and they publish it in the NFPA journal, their website, and documents. That was done in 2017. Over the next year, they took in public comments as to whether this project should go forward or it should be rejected. Surprising, at least to me anyway, was the response of the public comments were split evenly, about 50-50 in favor versus opposed. This surprised me because, you know, we all know how much the public service industry, and I'll include the privates in there as well, because most of us came from the public sector, how much we like change and how much we like oversight with new standards and documents. So I was expecting this to be overwhelmingly opposed, but it was 50-50. One of the underlying goals of the OSAC committee in proposing this new standard was to hopefully provide the fire investigation units with some type of document that had some teeth in it, which would assist them in trying to push to get funding for their fire investigation units and their investigators. You know, as I'm sure everyone viewing this experiences, there's always limitations of personnel and resources. You know, they're one of the largest departments in the United States, only had $3,000 allotted for training for their fire investigation unit, which was huge. So there was very little resources provided. This standard, the goal for this standard was to provide something that these units could rely on to help push for additional resources. In December of 2018, the Standards Council decided to appoint the committee to begin the development of the new document. And it was at this time in December of 2018 that I was appointed chairman of this committee. The important issue with this committee and this particular standard was the scope needed to be very, very well defined. And fortunately, the Standards Council did a very good job identifying the scope. The scope that the Standards Council appointed for the committee was the document shall have primary responsibility for standards relating to the development and composition of fire investigation units. Notice this last sentence, that is the key. The committee does not have responsibility for the development of standards relating to fire investigation techniques, methodologies, i.e. 921, or fire investigator professional qualifications, 1033. So this committee cannot get into the fire investigation or the qualifications to be a fire investigator, because you do not want it, or NFPA did not want to set up a conflict between this new standard and either 1033 or 921. So they made a very tight scope. Initially, the committee had, only 23 members. And these are the classifications. Every NFPA committee, every person appointed falls under one of 9 classifications that NFPA has. I am a special expert being on the private sector. We have, enforcers, which would be ATF, and fire marshals. We have for users, this is generally your association. The IAAI has a representative on the 1321 committee. We have insurance representatives, and then you have the lone consumer. And a consumer is probably the nicest term you've ever heard attorneys referred to as. So we have one attorney on this committee who was a district attorney out of Pennsylvania. Now, since the initial appointment of the committee, there's been others added. So now the committee is up to closer to 30 people. And anyone can apply, which we'll talk about here in a little while when we get to 921. The initial meeting of this group was a conference call in January of 2019. So the committee was appointed in December and held our first conference call in January. The first job that we had was to define what FIU was. The committee had to come up with a working definition first. The definition that the committee is going forward with currently is a unit within a private or public sector agency with responsibility for fire or explosion investigation. So as you can see, it is pretty close to what OSAC had recommended, but it will incorporate both the private and the public sector investigators. The committee, the next task I assigned to the committee was that we had to come up with an outline of the document. What did we believe the document would look like? When OSAC submitted their request, they submitted an outline. And the committee voted to basically adopt the outline that had been submitted. The first 3 chapters of all NFPA documents are the same: the administration, references, and definitions. Those are all the same regardless of the document. The other chapters gets into the specifics related to the investigation unit, the organization, process, and management system, the resources, safety, training, certification, education, documentation, and reports. This was the basic outline that the committee began to work with. Task groups were appointed, by me to outline each and every chapter. So, Chapter 4, there was a task group put together that involved a task group chairman and members of the committee. Their job was to develop the outline for that chapter and bring it back to the full committee for approval. The last thing you want a task group to do is go down the road, do a lot of work, bring it to the committee, and the committee say, well, that's not the direction we wanted you to go. So one of the things I have instituted, I did this with 921 and I brought it over to 1321, is the task group develops a outline, then the committee approves it, then they can go forward and begin developing text. This keeps them everyone on track and everyone on the same page. Next steps. The committee met to finalize the drafts in 2020. We submitted our draft to the Standards Council this spring. The Standards Council will be reviewing it at their meeting in August. And we will get a public input out probably late 2021. And that will start the process. The document will be open for public input for some time. Then the Standards Council will, once public input is completed, the public comments period will start and the committee will review all of those. Likely we're looking at 2023 is the earliest we may see this standard. So we're early in the process. The committee has gone through it. We've developed a draft. The next step is get public input, get it out there to the public and get their input on it. You know, based on the current direction that the committee is going, the document will be written as a standard using standard language, and it's going to be comprised of instructions concerning the policies the fire investigation unit needs to have in place to have an effective and efficient operation. The committee is not going to establish what the policies are. And this is really due to the dramatic differences between organizations. The policies that, for example, ATF may have on evidence is going to be dramatically different than the policies that the fire investigation unit for the Madison Fire Department will have versus the policies on evidence that SEA may have. So the committee can't establish what the policies must be, but can provide direction that you should have policies and the policies should address certain things. One of the goals is that the committee will have the time to develop some sample policies for the annex so that if your agency needs a policy on something and doesn't have one or doesn't know how to prepare the policies, there will be some guidance given in the annex material to be able to prepare those policies. Give you something to go by and something to work with. But again, we're still in the early stages and look forward to the public input and to continue to make the document better. So let's move from a document in draft to the oldest of the fire investigation documents. Many think of 921 as the older document because it's been so well known and popular. And I sometimes put popular in quotation marks. But actually 1033 is an older document, older standard, going back to the 80s. And most people don't realize that. The next edition will have a 2022 edition date on it. Now we will be going through this discussion based on the first draft revisions and the second draft revisions. Since we don't have a document that I can look at, you have to compare the committee changes in the first draft with the committee changes in the second draft to understand what the document will look like. It's only a 16-page document, so it's not, it's not very long. Our timeline, public input closed in January of 19. The committee met in February of 19. And due to changes within Nfpa and how they were going to move forward with things, the committee had to come back in January of 2020 and meet once again. The first draft of the report will be was posted in July of 2020, with public comments closed October. So you have a first draft of the document. Then there is the second draft, which completes the changes that you see. The committee met in October to review the public comments. The second draft will be posted next week. So it should be available the week of April the 5th. And then after its initial posting, there is a period for appeal. If you have submitted a public input and you did not like the committee's actions and you submitted a comment and then you still did not like the committee's action, you have a right to put forth a notice of intent to make a motion, a NITMAM. This is basically asking the general membership at the technical session, which would be held in July or June, to rule on this particular topic. And it has to be a yes or no question. And many times it is yes, accept the submitter's change, or send it back to the committee and send the document back to the committee to evaluate this, or no, reject the submitter's request. That would be posted, if there is one, by May. I don't expect there to be any NITMAMs. We've never had one relating to 1033, and I've been on this committee for a few cycles now. And likely we will see the document published the latter part of this year. If we have no NITMAMs, it will be approved by consent and issued by the Standards Council, probably early summer. But if we have any issues, it may be a little bit later. For any NFPA document, there's a public notice goes out with a closing date that it is open for public input, which is part of the first draft. And anyone can submit a proposal to change the document. And this can be any change. It can be add a chapter, it can be delete a chapter, it can be you missed a comma or the wrong word is there. It can request any change. However, you must provide a reason for the change, and you must provide how you want the document to read. You can't just say section 1.1.3 is wrong and should be rewritten. You have to say section 1.1.3 is incorrect and should be reworded to read, and then here is the reasoning. The committee has to act on every public input that's received. And it literally takes 5 minutes to do this on an NFPA website. You can go to the website, go to that committee page, and submit a public input. It takes very little time. Now remember, 1033 is a 16-page document, and we received 108 public inputs. That's not, doesn't sound like a lot, but for a 16-page document, that's quite a bit. That was compared to 61 public inputs that we received for the 2014 edition. And those 108 public inputs comprised 117 pages of the ballot that we had to review. So the committee has to review all of these pages of the ballot to make a determination on how they want to vote with regards to all these public inputs. The second draft is the second part of this. After the first draft has been published, you have the opportunity to make a comment. But the comment must be on something that was addressed during the first draft, period. If you want to make a comment on section 8.3, if 8.3 was not addressed during the public input stage, that will not be accepted. So you have to make your comment on something that was addressed during the public input stage. Again, the same principles apply. There's deadlines, there's forms on the website. And again, the committee must review and act on every public comment that is submitted. In this instance, we only had 16 comments, which I was very surprised considering the changes. And of those, we actually had less comments than we had in the 14 edition. And we comprised of about 47 pages of documents that we had to review to evaluate those public comments. Well, 1033 is a minimum qualification standard with JPR requirements. It applies to both public and private. The requirements in 1033 can be exceeded by the local entity or agency. So you can make your requirements more, but they must at least meet these. And 137 and 138, which is where what came to be known as the 16 topics every fire investigator needs to know about in chapter 1, was removed. But they weren't removed from the document. They were removed from the administration chapter, and a lot of that information went into chapter 4, which we will take a look at. And then there were various definitions pulled from 921 and included in 1033. So in chapter 1 there was significant revisions to it. That this standard identifies the position of a fire investigator, which kind of is outlined by the JPRs. There's 28 of them in chapter 4. It's the intent of the standard to ensure that fire investigators are qualified to do so. So you can see where this document might be used to challenge you concerning your qualifications. The JPRs for each duty are the task personnel shall be able to perform successfully. So those JPRs in chapter 4, you shall, it uses an S word, mandatory, be able to perform those successfully. Doesn't mean that each one of those will be carried out on every fire investigation, but you shall be able to perform them successfully. So you have to know how to perform them. Then we've got fire investigators who perform or support fire investigators shall remain current with the general knowledge, skills, and the JPRs. Every JPR has a task associated with it, a knowledge base that you have to have, and a skill that you must be able to perform. So if you're conducting a fire investigation or you're working with and supporting a fire investigator, you shall remain current with those particular items. In addition, those same people shall remain current with the practices and applicable standards. The easy answer here is you shall be current with 921 and 1033. The 1.3, as it was in the 14 edition, was completely deleted. And then it was replaced. And here is some of the things it was replaced with. The application. The application of this standard shall be to specify the JPRs. That is a common word that's used in all of the professional qualification standards within NFPA. Shall be to specify the JPRs that shall apply to specific personnel who perform and support fire investigations. The JPRs are to be accomplished in accordance with the requirements of the AHJ, again, typical NFPA language, and applicable NFPA and other standard development organizations. Again, shall be accomplished in accordance with 921, 1033, and you've got other ASTM standards and things like that. It shall not be required that JPRs are mastered in particular order. The main thing is you know how to perform them. Here is something that's important, that the AHJ shall establish instructional priority. So it's the AHJ's responsibility to have a priority and a training program content to prepare the investigator to meet the JPRs. I dare say this is something that many or most don't have, but this will be in the, so this will give you some ammunition to take to the command staff to say, 1033 is stating this, we need to have more resources so that we can be prepared to meet the JPRs that are outlined in Chapter 4. Performance of each of the requirements shall be evaluated. There should be some evaluation process that you can perform the JPRs in an acceptable manner. It shall be completed in accordance with recommended recognized practices and procedures, or as defined by AHJ or law. So there should be something laid out there. You can use 921, 1033, but there should be a directions laid out on how to complete the JPRs. The fire investigator who perform or the support investigation shall meet the requirements of this standard for each investigation they perform. 1.3.2.6, I think, is very important to be aware of. This is requiring the AHJ to provide the necessary protective equipment for the investigators. Safety has been something that has been very lax in the fire investigation community historically. Fortunately, in the last 5-6 years, there has been a growing movement concerning protecting the fire investigators, especially as it relates to inhalation issues, cleaning of equipment, and not taking all of the contaminants and things with us to our homes, our vehicles, things like that. There's a greater emphasis on safety, and 1033 is pushing this as well. Now, Chapter 4 is where those 16 topics, or some of, got moved to. Chapter 4 is really the guts of 1033. That's where all 28 of the JPRs are located. And so a new section 4.1.7 was added, and we'll talk about that little asterisk here in a few minutes. In order to successfully complete the task identified in the JPRs, the fire investigator shall, that S word again, remain current in the subject listed as requisite knowledge as they relate to fire investigation, which include the following. Now, there's a couple things that are very important with those, with that introductory few sentence, words. shall remain current. That's why your CV is incredibly important. When I attend, when you attend a seminar and you get a certificate, consider putting a list of the classes with that certificate. That way, if you're asked about it, you can go back and go, well, here's what we discussed. Because it says you shall remain current. You can only demonstrate that you're current by the documentation you have. So your CV is really, really important. Also, the knowledge of these topics is limited to how they relate to fire investigation. There were challenges of expert talking about the chemistry. In the previous edition of 1033, it said you should have basic knowledge of these beyond high school. So someone may lay a chemistry book down in front of you, a high school chemistry book, and start questioning you about it. Well, what did you learn in high school chemistry about fire? Well, you learned a lot of things, but some of it wasn't really directly related to fire. Most of what we learned about all of these topics were after high school. But we're linking the knowledge base of these topics to fire investigation. Thermodynamics is an incredibly broad topic. We don't necessarily need you to know everything there is about thermodynamics, because you could get a PhD in any one of many parts of thermodynamics. But you should understand thermodynamics as it relates to fire investigation. So we took the knowledge topics and broke them up into 4 groups. The first group is fire science. And here you see the first 4 items. One of the things missing from this group is thermometry. In evaluating the topics to go in here, we went through all of the JPRs to make sure if it was in the list that there was a JPR that had requisite knowledge that applied. There was none relating to thermography, so it was removed from the list. The second group was fire investigation. And again, here's 5 items on the list. An item is also missing from this group as well, and that is computer fire modeling. None of the JPRs we could find related to fire modeling as being a knowledge that they had to have to complete the JPR. Should you know something about computer fire modeling? Absolutely. But it is not something that you must have knowledge of to perform the JPRs, which sets out the qualifications. Third group is fire safety. We've talked about that, incredibly important. Most all of us know of people who are either dealing with or unfortunately have passed away from various cancers and hazards associated with investigation of fires. We need to be very, very cognizant of our health and safety as we conduct these investigations. And then the final group was building systems. Now, if you add all these up, there's actually 17 now instead of the 16. But each one of these, for example, types of construction, well, where might types of construction be important? If you're dealing with fire spread and fire dynamics, it might be important to know how the building is built, because that may have impacted how the fire spreads. Now, if you remember, there was an asterisk at the beginning of this. Here is some of the things that are part of that. I didn't go through the entire list, but I mentioned thermodynamics. This list is going to help give you information on things you should be aware of as it relates to that topic, as it relates to fire investigation. So it's providing you additional information, whether it's fire chemistry, and you need to have a knowledge of fuels, because fuels is part of that fire tetrahedron that is directly related to the competency of the ignition source. So these are providing you with additional information to understand what you need to know, and not just these broad topics. Again, more examples. Under fire dynamics, talking about the fire spread and radiant heat and various flames and ventilation, giving you specific topics that you can then go to 921 and look up, because these are tied very closely with 921. Something else in the back of 1033 was a list of all the JPRs. It makes it very easy to go through the entire list of JPRs in one location, as opposed to having to flip through a bunch of pages. And it goes through each JPR and it lists, here's what the task is that you have to know how to perform successfully. And there is the final group. Again, 1033 should be out in the coming months. So now we move to what was the big red char looking book to now it's kind of a big blue char looking book. And it's actually the 10th edition of 921. Typically, it's been out about every 3 years. You have 2 instances between 2004 and 2008, and 2017 and 2021, where you had a 4-year span, and those were due to different things that happened within NFPA. But 10 editions of 921. Some of the keys to the NFPA process is due process. There is a specific process that you must follow. That's why when people get on the committee, it takes them a little while to understand the NFPA process and how we do things. There's an openness. Anyone can attend an NFPA committee meeting anytime. They are completely open to the public. The only ask is that you send a notice to the NFPA staff liaison for that committee and the chairman, notifying them you would like to attend. That's primarily to make sure we have room or have a big enough room for everyone to meet when we get back to meeting in person, hopefully soon. If you would like to speak, that is at the discretion of the chair and most chairs will allow you to speak if you have submitted a public input or comment, and those come up for discussion, will allow you to speak to them. There's a lack of dominance, which we will talk about in just a moment. And the bad thing about 921 is you've got to buy a new one every 3 years. The good thing about 921 is a new one comes out every 3 years. It allows us to keep up with the latest science and technology and research. If we had to wait 5 years, then we're kind of behind the curve. Every 3 years is about a good balance to be able to bring in the latest and greatest into 921 on a timely basis. So that's kind of a double-edged sword. The 921 committees are, and all NFPA committees are consensus bodies, and that means everything in the document requires a 2/3 vote of the committee to pass ballot. Typically they're about 30 is the size they like to keep. And as you can see, there's an awful lot of people that are all volunteers on these committees. No one is paid. I pay all of my own expenses. And over the last, going on 30 years that I've been attending meetings, it adds up pretty significantly. Got over 235 committees now with over 300 documents. Some committees have more than one document. Whereas 921, 1033, and 1321 are all done by separate committees. This is the categories. We mentioned this dealing with 1321. Special expert, again, this are private sector. The users, the 921, are the IAAI has a member, the iChiefs, the Nfpa, various associations have members on the committee. So we have insurance, we've got research and testing by NIST and UL, enforcement, we've got the manufacturers represented. This happens to be SAE, Society of Automotive Engineers. Boeing has a representative on the committee, and NEMA, the National Electrical Manufacturers Association, has a representative on the committee. And then there's those four, attorney consumer types that are in there. So as you can see, balance, no one classification can have more than 1/3 representation, so that no one group can gain control of the document. Now, I've heard it referred to many times, well, that's a plaintiff's document or that's this document. As you can see, there is no one that has more than 8 members on the committee. We've got 2 different ones that have 7, and then it's down from there. So no one can gain control of the committee. This happens to be a photograph of a committee meeting from many years ago. Actually, all the way underneath the screen at the end, you see me sitting, and that's when I was actually secretary of the committee back in the early 2000s. That was a good picture of our committee most of the time. Sometimes, because of the passion everyone brings to the committee, the passion gets the best of us, and the debates get, shall we say, vigorous. And there's been times when I've had to call people out of order. I've had to take a break and take a couple of committee members outside and discuss the issues so we can move forward. Everyone brings tremendous passion to the committee, which is one of the things I love. But it does get out of control at times. Membership on the committee is continually monitored. As chairman, I get a email from Nfpa long about the August timeframe, and their email is asking for my evaluation of all the committee members to either reappoint or recommend removal. If they have not been participating, and if they have committed the cardinal sin of not returning ballots, they can be removed. I have made recommendations to remove in the past because of a lack of involvement. We have probably 2 pages, single spaced, of those waiting on a waiting list that want to be a part of the committee. So with all of that interest, there's no reason for spots to be taken up by people that aren't willing to be involved. One question that has came up, and the first time this question came up to me was actually in Wisconsin, when I was asked about why are there not term limits on the actual committee members. And not knowing the answer, I went to Nfpa, and they explained that many committees are only 10 or 12 members. As such, if they put term limits, they could end up with a committee without members very easily. And they can't put limitations on one committee and not put it on all committees across the board. So there are no term limits for committee members. However, as the chairman, I am limited to 10 years or 3 cycles. I was appointed chairman in January of 2008. I stepped down as chairman in September of 2020. Now you can do the math, and it's pretty easy to realize I was chair for longer than 10 years and 3 cycles. My time actually came up in the middle of a cycle, and NFPA asked me to stay on to complete the cycle, as opposed to changing chairman in the middle, which could create a little bit of a havoc. You do not have to be a member of NFPA to be a member of the technical committees. So simply go to the NFPA website and fill out an application to be on any NFPA committee, whether it's 1033, 1321, or 921. And you do not have to be a member of the technical committee to be on a task group. We've had many task groups where virtually the only committee member on the task group was the chairman. That was always a standing order that I had, that any task group, the chairman had to be a committee member, because that task group chairman is held accountable to getting the work done. So I always required the task group chairman to be a committee member. Here's the process that a document goes through. For 921, we had the first draft, and you can see the closing dates and when the first draft was posted versus the second draft. It was posted in February of last year, and we had no NetNams that we talked about before. As you can see in the lower right corner over here, there were no NetNams, and the document was published at the direction of the Standards Council in August of last year, and became available to most everyone beginning in September. But it's for a document to be in a 3-year cycle, this is kind of what happens throughout the process. And just like you saw with 1033 for the first draft, there's a closing date, and you can again make any change in the document you want, provided you state what the change is, you state how the document will read, and you provide the reason for the change. And in 921, we had over 500 public inputs. And again, the committee must review and act on every one of those public inputs. As such, there were 646 pages of documents for the committee to review. This is almost double the amount of public inputs we had for the 2017 edition. So tremendous interest in 921. If you are wondering why does the committee change the document every 3 years, here's your answer: because of the tremendous public input that the document receives. Second draft, again, the comments are limited to be put on proposals that were addressed in the first draft session, and we had 311. So there is well over 800 public input / comments to change 921, which was at that time about a 400-page document. This is almost 4 times as many as in the 2017 edition, and another 300 pages of ballot to review. So all total, we had close to 950 pages of documents to review in the changes that went into the newest edition of 921. Now, it's very easy to find a change in 921 now. It used to be a vertical line by a paragraph. Now, if there's a change in a paragraph, it is highlighted in the gray. If there is new material, there is a bold capital N that is highlighted in gray beside it. So it is very, very easy to thumb through 921 and identify changes. We have more changes than in any edition other than the first edition when it was all new. We have changes in every chapter, Some are, updating references or editorials. We've got chapters completely revised. We've got a chapter that was deleted, but kind of. The chapter was deleted, but the material is still referenced. The first edition of 921 in 1992 was 14 chapters and 119 pages. Now we're at 29 chapters, 217 definitions, 17 of which are new to this edition. And now we're at 450 pages. 921 has grown up significantly over the years. It's very easy to get a copy of 921. Go to the NFPA website. You see there at the bottom of the page to order it. Unfortunately, there is no PDF versions of NFPA documents going forward. NFPA made a decision, and that decision, I wasn't happy with it, and I don't know of anybody that was outside of NFPA, to protect their intellectual property. And in doing so, that meant the elimination of the PDF versions. They have instituted what they call NFPA Link, which is a subscription service to be able to access these documents. And they're moving documents there as you go. So that is their answer right now to a lack of PDF documents. I'm in hopes they will do some things going forward that may make it a little easier to get the access. One of the things that occasionally happens when you've got a document the size of 921 is something will get missed. In this case, a tentative interim amendment was issued after the document came out, when it was realized that we had changed the definitions of the fire patterns in the text, but forgot to change it in the definitions chapter. So that is what occurred, and this was important enough that it was included as a tentative interim amendment to correct that. The second issue was during the first draft, various references to the scientific method in chapter 6 and others changed the fifth step of the scientific method to read develop more than one hypothesis. And during the second draft, the committee felt that that was not correct, that we shouldn't be telling people how many that they should develop, but that they should develop hypotheses to address, the what that we discussed earlier in the session. Also, there was a change for the sixth step of testing, and it was changed during the first draft to test the hypothesis for validity. This was changed to simply test hypotheses. All your hypotheses that you develop should be tested, and as we spoke earlier, they're to be tested in an attempt to disprove the hypothesis. So that was important. If you ordered a later printing of 921, these changes are already made. If you got one of the first printings when they first came out, these changes aren't in the document. So just to make you aware of it. In chapter 1, we deleted the part about the concepts are presented in an elementary level. There's not really anything in 921 that's presented at an elementary level. It's all pretty technical and high level. The important thing to me with this statement is additional technical resources, training and education may often need to be utilized. Not everything you need or need to know is in 921. You're going to need to rely on other documents, research, and information. Don't be afraid to go after and use other things to support you in your investigations. Some of the definitions that we added a section for canines in the definition chapter, talking about the handler and the team itself. And these are in conjunction with changes made in chapter 15 and 17, which we'll talk about when we get to that chapter in the document. Additional definitions. You see various there on ARCs. ARC mapping was a big discussion that's addressed in the document, and that discussion was moved from the origin chapter and the electrical chapter to the patterns chapter. We added a definition on cause. Notice this isn't fire cause, this is simply cause. Talking about the circumstances, conditions, or agencies that brought about or resulted in a fire explosion incident, damaged property, bodily injury, or loss of life. So it's a much broader topic. Additional definitions, non-scene data I mentioned earlier. Chapter 14 was rewritten to make it more useful to the investigator. Minimum ignition energy. This definition was pulled into the chapter due to the changes in the explosion chapter in the last edition and the expansion of the discussion on dust explosions. This was important enough that the committee wanted this definition to be upfront in chapter 3. Ventilation is probably the biggest issue that we have realized over the last 15 plus years. We always kind of understood it from a firefighting standpoint, even back in the 70s when I first got into the fire service. We understood about, if you're ventilating a room from the outside, you break the top of the window out to vent the gases out, because that's where the heat is. And then when you go in, you get on your hands and knees. And so we understood it from the firefighting standpoint, but we never understood ventilation really from the effects it had on pattern generation inside. So this has been a big discussion, and changes to the ventilation definition. The fire effects and fire patterns chapter, we've added a flow chart following the scientific method on how do you apply it. The ARC mapping discussion was moved to this chapter, with the committee basically determining that identification of arcing locations forms a pattern. And that was the reasoning that that discussion got all moved into one location, as opposed to it being broken up into 3 different locations. As you can see, and I apologize, this is directly out of the ballot whenever it was put together, and I've got to get a better image here. But remember, we talked about understanding versus application. Well, this is to help the readers apply the scientific method to fire pattern analysis. One of the things that we did was about fire effects, and you can see this call out box to the right. We added a chart talking about the various fire effects categories of discoloration, deformation, deposition, and mass loss, and what would be examples of each to help the investigator in their analysis of fire patterns. And well, you have to develop a hypothesis based on your analysis of the patterns to explain the significance of the patterns. What do they mean? Then you got to challenge that hypothesis against all the known facts. And then ultimately you're selecting a final hypothesis to explain what the cause of the pattern is. Again, you're explaining the what. That's all the way up at the top of the scientific method. I mentioned that we moved the electrical arcing to chapter 6, and it's in 6.3.21 and following is where that discussion is. And we talk about the conductors. we talk about, arc damage to a conductor as evidence that it was energized at the time. And that the fire effects are sufficient to break down the insulation, resulting in electrical discharge. So all of this was consolidated in one location. We talk about arc sites are evidence that the circuit was energized. And the 6321.10.1.1 talks about if you're doing an arc map or an arc survey, as some people refer to it, and you can't examine the entire structure or portions of the conductor, then don't take your analysis beyond what you can examine and analyze. One new section that was added, and it was kind of interesting when the committee realized that, and it was pointed out by someone submitting a comment, that we had no discussion in 921 on heating systems. So we added a section to the building systems chapter to address heating systems, and we've limited it to boilers, furnaces, stoves, various radiant convection electric heaters, and then factory built versus masonry fireplaces. And we've done this, and we've limited it to residential and light commercial installations. And as you can see all the way at the bottom, roof mounted HVA systems are beyond the scope of what we're talking about here. I expect this section to grow in the coming years as we can provide more information on the analysis and documentation of heating systems. Chapter 8 on active fire protection systems. This chapter has grown. It's only been in the document for a few cycles, but we are providing better quality photographs and images to help the investigator understand and document the fire protection system and realize how this information can be valuable in conducting your analysis. The electrical chapter, the arc mapping discussion that was in the electrical chapter was also moved to the chapter 6. Again, to consolidate that in all one place. There were various changes to this chapter. Many were editorial and updating references. However, discussion was added concerning lithium-ion batteries. As I'm sure everybody's aware, lithium-ion batteries have been in the news in recent years concerning laptops, cell phone, and then more recently vapes, and the various incidents that have been documented. So an understanding of lithium-ion batteries, which is in many ways a chemical process, to understand what's going on and try to provide the investigators with some additional information, but also making them realize you're going to need some additional help and expertise when you evaluate these. Building fuel gas systems, when you see the term electrical bonding and grounding, many of us instantly think about the CSST related to gas systems. And in this section, we've added some direction that above ground piping should be bonded and grounded as described in the appropriate codes for the particular material and installation details, because it's the material and the installation where the codes come into play to determine how it should be installed and how it should be bonded and grounded. So that was the instructions we were providing the investigator. A small change to chapter 11. Basically, this was a change of how we referred to it. We updated the terminology to go from children and fire to youth fire setting behavior, which was more of a common term that is used today. The safety chapter, wasn't a complete revision. a task group has been appointed by the new chairman to review and revise this chapter. Two things I would point you to on the IAAI website. The document on the left is a one sheet front and back on best practices, quick facts. And the document on the right is the second edition, just came out last May, the Fire Investigator Health and Safety Best Practices. Both of these are on the IAAI website and are free for download. Please take your health seriously, take the health of your family and others that you're around seriously, so that you're not bringing this contamination home and spreading it to others. I can't stress this enough, and I'm glad we at IAAI have taken a lead in fire investigation and fire investigator health and safety. So please take a look at those two documents and download them and use those to protect yourself. You know, in addition, we've added discussion about proper PPE. Remember, this was discussed in the 1321 discussion that the AHJ should provide the proper PPE, and it needs to be used. While, you know, PPE is probably the least of the effective control measures, sometimes that's the only measure we have, because we do have to go in to conduct the investigation. Chapter 14 was sources of information. This chapter was, for the most part, useless to the fire investigator in the past. My charge to the task group when we had them rewrite this was make it applicable. The scientific method says we have to collect data. Make this chapter more beneficial to the investigator on what non-scene type data they should be collecting and where to find it. So this was an important addition to change. Chapter 15 and 17, this is where the changes concerning the canine handling teams were added. As you can tell, there were some fairly significant revisions here. Yeah, I think that first sentence for the chapter 15 is very important, that the canine handler teams are useful tools. They are incredibly useful tools. Like many tools, they have been misused in the past, but they are extremely valuable tools to assist the investigators in locating the presence of ignitable liquids, the best location to be able to collect samples. So they're valuable tools that can be used. But like every tool, you need to understand the strengths as well as the limitations of the tool itself. Documentation, I think this is one of the most important aspects that is often overlooked. This particular section talks about the written report, or as I like to say, telling the story. You have to be able to tell the story with your photographs, your documentation, with your report. You know, as you saw in that court case, many times a judge may evaluate your investigation based on that report. So take the time and make sure you are telling the story, both of the methodology you used and how you applied the methodology reliably. That's what the judge is going to be looking for. The origin determination, there were 4, and arc mapping was removed. However, it was included in the fire pattern. So now we are at 3. As you can see, fire patterns, the effects, the analysis of effects and patterns left by a fire, which may include patterns involving electrical conductors. The committee did not feel it, it was elevated to the level of needing to be its own, that it was included as a pattern. So that change was made. All of the discussion in Chapter 18 concerning art mapping was also moved, just like the discussion in the electrical chapter, to Chapter 6. In the origin chapter, it has a chart for applying the scientific method, just like other chapters, to help you with your application. Remember, understanding versus application. This is there to help you with your application. One of the things we talk about in Chapter 18 is experimental testing, and what it does and what it does not do. If the results are substantially similar to the damage, then we can say that it's consistent with the origin hypothesis. However, if the testing results are not substantially similar, then an alternative origin hypothesis or additional data may need to be considered. So just what can you say about the testing? And this was an important addition. Cause determination, again, as we've discussed, how do you apply cause determination using the scientific method? And providing you this example. Everybody hates to use the word undetermined. No one wants to put in their report undetermined. But, if you have no hypothesis that is uniquely consistent with the data related to cause, you have no other option. The final opinion is only as good as the quality of the data used. And you, as the investigator, are the ones that determines the quality and level of certainty of the opinions based on the quality of the data. So it's up to you to evaluate the data and understand the validity and the quality of the data in rendering your opinions. A chapter that there's been a tremendous amount of discussion, debate, and frustration about, the classification chapter. There's been tremendous confusion over the years over the cause of a fire versus the classification of a cause. And based on the discussion, the committee ultimately decided to remove the chapter and make the reference in another location. And part of this was based on that confusion. This wasn't a decision the committee looked at lightly. There was tremendous debate on this topic. And it was during the first draft, there was an attempt made to rewrite the chapter and make it more related to the incident classification, but the title was never changed. So it still said classification of fire cause, but a lot of the discussion was on classifying the incident. Well, during the second draft, there was a proposal from OSAC to delete the chapter. And one of the points they made was related to the change we made in the 2017 edition in Chapter 1 regarding inverse reports. And in that, the committee said inverse reports were incident reports and not investigative reports, and therefore they were outside the scope of 921. Another point was the problem, how do you apply the scientific method to fire cause classification? And additionally, there's different classifications. The inverse report has classifications that are different than 921 had. And if you're completing an inverse reports, it really doesn't matter what 921 says, you're limited to the classifications listed in that inverse dropdown. So after a lot of debate, it was deleted. Now we mentioned the change in Chapter 1 of 921. Well, this was the change in the 2017 edition. Prior to this, I had gotten a call from the Nfpa staff liaison stating that the various fire marshals associations were upset and wanted to talk about this. Their issue was so many of the inverse reports were coming back undetermined. And as a result, they were getting no statistics. And people were making them undetermined because they were afraid of getting beat up by 921. So I put together a task group of the Fire Marshals Association and committee members. And this was the change that went into the document, talking about that the inverse report is outside the scope of 921. We consider it an incident report and not an investigative report. That has made a difference. And this was the committee statement that we added. So since an inverse report was not part and not under the guidance of 921, that was another one of the arguments that, well, then there's no need to have a classification chapter. This is the committee substantiation for removing the chapter. The technical committee has fielded debates over chapter 20 text over the past editions, determined the chapter creates more issues than benefits. Since incident classification is addressed in other standards and is dependent on jurisdiction, organizational use, providing specific definitions for incident classifications in 921 is not necessary. However, we added a section at the end of the cause chapter about classification. If you are required to classify a fire cause, then we are referring you to those things that provide that guidance. If you're writing an inverse report, well, you need to refer to inverse or NFPA 901. We have people using this document around the world. You can see a citation for the Canadian code structure that provides classification information and others. So the information was not completely deleted, but the references to it was moved to the cause chapter, and the readers are directed to those documents that are more appropriately addressing cause or incident classification. We added a change to chapter 21 on failure mode and effects, FMEAs. This is a predictive design that's used by engineers, and this can be used to kind of reverse engineering to understand how something operates, which may give you some idea as to what actually failed. Now, some of the slides you will see from here forward, you will see me reference chapter 21, but in the ballot, you will see it referenced to chapter 22. The ballot has to reference the edition that's in print. So I am referencing it as chapter 21 because chapter 20 has been removed. So all of these chapters are going to shift back one. The incendiary chapter, we added made some changes to this chapter. Some of this is related to changing chapter 20 or deleting it and moving that references. The key to the incendiary chapter is it is used after you've determined the origin of a fire and a cause. Once you've determined the cause, then this chapter can assist you in identifying potential suspects or witnesses for interview and give you further direction. Vehicle fires, we've added some additional information. See, we're discussing diesels. We're seeing more and more diesel fueled vehicles in the country now. So there had not been a lot of information in 921 prior. So again, beefing up various sections as information becomes available. The wildfire chapter had tremendous debate. It had not been completely reviewed in many editions. There had been various sections changed, but not a complete overview. I had appointed a task group to review the entire chapter and provide a revision. They were charged with bringing it in line with the scientific method, as many of the other chapters in 921, as you have seen, are, to help with application, of how do you apply the scientific method to a wildfire investigation. The task group actually failed to reach consensus. There were two groups, one that wanted to outline the chapter in the application of the scientific method, and the other group was with a wildfire organization, and they did not like that direction, and they reached an impasse. So I asked the task group to bring a report to the full committee, and one to discuss the outline based on the scientific method, and one based on the outline presented by the other group. I gave both groups 15 minutes to present to the committee, and then the committee was allowed to ask questions, discuss, and debate the two proposed outlines. The committee voted to proceed with the scientific method outline. So the task group continued working on a revision of the chapter. At the first draft meeting, when we were looking at all of the public input provided by the public, those 500 plus, a committee member presented a proposal for a rewrite of the chapter ahead of the task group. And this proposal got accepted by the full committee as committee input. When the ballot was circulated for actions on all public input, this revision passed ballot by one vote. Remember, consensus is 2/3. This specific public input had 2/3 plus one vote. There was significant public comments to review this, with many issues being raised. As a result, I appointed a new task group to evaluate all these public comments and bring back recommendation to the committee and how do we proceed. The task group reported to the committee 3 options. We can revise the first draft because there were conflicts with other sections of 921. We can adopt the task group proposal, but that needed to be revised, or we could revert back to the 2017 text with the goal of reviewing and revising during the next cycle. After a lot of debate, it was a unanimous decision by the committee to revert back to 2017 edition. And the new chairman of 921 committee has appointed a new task group, and they're going to attempt once again to rewrite this chapter. So it'll be interesting to see how this goes in the next cycle. And this is the committee's substantiation for our proposal, or for not rewriting it, and given the differing points of view and continuing debate, is the committee's decision to not make any changes to chapter 28 at this time. Thus, the committee has decided to keep the text as it currently exists in the 2017 edition. It is the committee's intent to continue to work on enhancements of chapter 28 for future editions and encourage public input in the next cycle. So hopefully we will get a lot more public input. And we added a lot of annex material to this edition. So when you see asterisks in the document, go to the back and look in the annex for what is the base material and support. During my early years on the 921 committee, I was speaking somewhere and someone asked me if I would sign their 921, which shocked me. And I'd never done that before. So I wrote their name and I wasn't sure what to write, but it came to me, keep on learning. So that's what I signed in the book, keep on learning, and then I put my name. As I mentioned early today, the goal is not just keep on learning, but to keep on investing. You know, investing in yourself and investing in others. Because the more you do that, the better you will be. My favorite quote in regards to learning and getting better is from my favorite actor, who's been gone a long time now, and is known for his quotes and tremendous patriot. And but look at what the Duke had to say about tomorrow. Tomorrow is the most important thing in life. It comes to us at midnight, very clean. It's perfect when it arrives. It puts itself in our hands. It hopes we've learned something from yesterday. If your goal is to be better tomorrow, that will only happen if you're investing today. If you don't invest today, you have no hope of getting better tomorrow. So I hope through this presentation, you've learned something today that will make you better tomorrow. I greatly appreciate everyone attending, and thank DCARI for putting these on.
Randy, thank you so much. Super detailed. And I just want to express our appreciation, not only to you, but to all the individuals on the committee that are investing in the future of fire investigations and serve on all these committees. So we really do appreciate your time. We're going to bring Randy back for a live question and answer period. We'll put that up on our website. There'll also be a 10-question test that Randy will provide us with the questions for. And then you can get a tested certificate for attending the training. So Randy, again, we really do appreciate your time. Thank you so much.
Thank you.